Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Middlesex University MBA webinar. I'm Roger Klein, I'm Research Fellow at Middlesex University. You should have had Vijaya Nath. Vijaya's got technical problems trying to get in from where she is in Nottingham. We're hoping she will join us, and if she does, I will immediately disappear and you will have Vijaya as your host. But in the meantime, we thought we should start. And can I introduce the two panel members, Stella Vig and Farah Bhatti, and they are both very well qualified they're both very active in amongst doctors and surgeons in sort of trying to raise the profile of this issue and ensure that serious action is taken by the NHS both to recognise the challenge of sexual harassment and to start to address it. So I'm going to start, if I may, by let me just start with Stella. Stella, I'm going to ask you, why do you think it's taken so long for the issue of sexual harassment and the kind of sexism involving doctors in particular, but not just doctors, to sort of finally surface in the NHS as an issue we need to address?
So I think it's taken time for people to find voices. And this is a cultural issue that is just not in healthcare, Roger. This is across the piece. The Me Too movements, and I know you've had a fantastic launch with the film industry this week. The Me Too movement, I think, has started to develop that collective understanding that we are all in this together. We need to call it out. And actually, it is not whistleblowing. It is every person's right, because this is not just about gender, but this is every person's right to work in a safe environment, cultural safety, diversity and safety. And with the increasing diversity that is now the healthcare industry, as it were, that ability to find someone who will listen, who will amplify your voice, and actually will take action, I think that has been absolutely important in terms of developing change. But Farah, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Farah.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Stella. I think you're right, Stella. A lot of things have happened, not least COVID, George Floyd, Me Too, leading to people feeling that, we can take action. We know about these problems. These problems haven't suddenly appeared. They've been there throughout my career, but it's now people are feeling empowered to speak up. Everyone's paid lip service to this issue for many a year, but very few people step up and actually speak and call it out. I'm afraid I'm one of those troublemakers who speak and call it out as I see. And I'd quite like to give maybe a surgical perspective. Clearly, this is an issue across healthcare and not just in the NHS, in wider society. But I think if you look back at recent data, we have 15% of our consultant workforce are women. And you might say that's fantastic, because it was 3% of but is that such great progress, given for decades we've had more women going to medical school than men? And we all know about the leaky pipeline. If you're an academic, you've heard that, and all the great work that Athena Swan did. But all sorts of things contribute to the lack of women progressing in surgery. And I think one of the biggest contributors are the fact that the culture, the culture and behaviours that some people are made to tolerate to get through to advancing their career, some people will just not accept it, and quite right. So I think the work's always, we've always known there's a problem, but of course it's come to the fore with the Independent Working Party on sexual misconduct, which was co-led by Tamsin Cummings, I don't want to forget name checking people, and Professor Carrie Newlands, and alongside a publication in the British Journal of Surgery in September of last year, which you all must read if you haven't so far. And the stats in that paper are all damning. They're shocking, they're damning, whatever word you want to use. Just under 2,000 people were surveyed. And you talk about sort of bias in sort of filling in the forms, but across the surgical workforce. And it revealed that 2/3 of women have been subjected to, they're not victims, have been subjected to sexual harassment, not just sexism or misogyny, the common garden stuff that is clearly not acceptable, but 2/3 of women and 1/5 of men, because it's not a women-only issue, although predominantly it is, have been subjected to sexual harassment. And what is worse, I think even worse than that, of course, nothing can be worse than being, subject to this behaviour, is that 90% of women and 80% of men, or 81%, have witnessed this behaviour. So what does that say about all of us in the environment, actually watching it, walking past that standard? And it's not new news. Surviving in Scrubs, if you're interested in this arena, had also published stuff. And one of the things they called for, in addition to the current working party's sort of recommendations, is that there needs to be support in place for people, because people won't come forward. Very few people come forward. And I personally wouldn't blame them, because, you've already been traumatized. You're having your career threatened. Your working environment has become unsafe. You sort of, I don't want to speak on behalf of people, but the fear must be unbearable. Of course, we are now doing things that I'm very much deeds, not words, although words are important. We've got the NHS charter that lots of trusts and ICBs have signed up to, and it's apparently mandates reviewing policies and having a lead for sexual violence, because there's that grey area, isn't it? Is it just not enough to report? If it's something that you feel is wrong, it is worth reporting. Is it a police matter? Oh, and nobody wants to sort of stick their head above the parapet. So it's about time things were taken seriously. And we're doing a lot of work at the Royal College of Surgeons of England with my council member hat on to try to support the working party, our response to the working party. So I'll stop there. But that's sort of the background within surgery. And really, I don't think, I've worked with things like the Kennedy Review, Baroness Kennedy's Review. I don't think we can say, I haven't seen it, therefore it doesn't happen. I think we're beyond that now. Thank you for indulging me, Roger.
No, not at all. And I'm delighted that Vijaya has joined us. So in a moment, Vijaya, I'm going to ask you to take over. But in the meantime, you might want to respond to the opening question, which was, why do you think it's taken so long for the issue to surface, and how can we sustain that? And then I'm going to be cheeky and suggest you take over chairing, if that's okay with you. We can't hear you. Vijaya, we don't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
I think I was muted by the host, which is what should happen when you just come into Zoom. Hi, everyone. I mean, I think that I work in a number of sectors, as some of you know, and I think this issue of sexism and misogyny is as old as time. I think for too long, though, once Me Too came, in healthcare and in higher education, it lay below the surface. And I think now some very brave women have put their head, and some men, above the parapet. And I think it's no longer something that can be put back into Pandora's box. It's come out. I think for me, the really serious issue, and I'd be really interested in hearing what Stell thinks on this. It was really lovely to hear Farah's got the statistics, is that to solve this issue, we're seeing more women go into surgery and medicine, but they won't be attracted to stay in surgery and follow the surgical route if sexism and misogyny is allowed to carry on as it has been. The thing is, it's to keep it in perspective. This is not happening everywhere all the time, but the fact that it's happening, the fact that we have reports out, the fact that people are choosing not to go into certain careers is worrying. I think the other reason, in terms of answering your question about why has it taken so long to come to the surface, is if the person who is involved holds power over you, so they have the ability to sign you off give you the next step in your career, you're less likely to be able to put your head up and say, this is what's going on. So coercion, power imbalance, it's different for different people. And I think there's an intersectional component of this, which means it plays out differently for different people. But I'd be really pleased to hear from Stella on the national picture, what she's coming across and what she thinks about this.
So Vijaya, thank you. So it's interesting. The one conversation that is loud and clear in the NHS at the moment is the conversation about productivity. And actually, productivity in itself, I don't like the term. If we're going to change the NHS and hold true to its purpose, which is free at the point of care, ensuring that health inequity and health inequality are not increased by the need to have financial stability, so free at the point of access and accessible to all, then actually the conversation about creating a productive environment in the NHS has got to be key to our future. So if we're going to create a productive environment, we know from various studies that have taken place that if you've got the right culture in place, the team is more productive. Very interesting data, which is interesting to read, that says if you have female surgeons in your team, actually your outcomes, I'm glad Farah's smiling, I love reading the paper every time I see it, that actually your outcomes are better. Now, is that because women have particular skills that makes assumptions? Is it because there is more cohesion in the team? Is it just because you've got more diversity of thought? And I think the diversity of thought for me is the most important conversation. And again, I keep going back to this is diversity of thought, which is not just about gender. I think, Vijay, your conversation about intersectionality is really, really important here, because how someone looks does not, how if you assume a person's particular characteristics by how they look, you can underplay all the other conversations that happen. So I'm an Asian female, but actually I'm not. I'm also born in Wales. I'm a surgeon. I'm a mother. There are so many things that play into this conversation. So the productive environment comes from cultural, personal, and I say intelligent safety are on my conversation. And I think there's a couple of things here. If we think about sexual safety and think about it in the silo of professionalism at work, we're actually missing a trick here. It's the same conversation as to improving the cost of care. If we want to improve the cost of care, we've got to get the prevention in, but the prevention conversation has to start when you've got children in kindergarten who say, Mum, I don't, or Dad, or partner, whoever it is, I don't want that sweet because actually it's not going to be good for me. And those conversations start from the very beginning. So the conversation here is just as important. So let me just give you some more data. So in the NHS sexual harassment survey, 58,000 people responded. What they said was that unwanted sexual approaches and harassment from the public and from patients was 1 in 12. 1 in 26 came from members of their own work and colleagues. And Farah, from the surgical study, we know that unwanted sexual advances from a conversation through to rape. So, and we know that these accelerate, that one leads to another, leads to another. And I cannot believe that this is only happening in a professional environment. This continues into their personal environment. And actually the survey that we have from the Royal College of Surgeons looks at data in terms of colleague on colleague, but actually these are people who are looking after patients, and we need to make sure the IBI, the Infected Blood Inquiry has just reported, we need to listen to our patients, we need to make sure they're safe, and I think this carries on to here. Domestic violence, 2.1 million people in the UK. Of those, about 1.4 million are women, but there are 790,000 men. This goes across the divide. So the Sexual Safety Charter, and if we may post the link into the chat a little bit later, Sexual safety charter needs to be every single NHS trust. It needs to be every single NHS partner. It needs to go out into institutions. Vijaya, and I know you and Roger are leading the way. And I think Too Hot to Handle needs to be pulled into this conversation too, because this has wide-reaching effects. So for me, Vijaya, if we can create a productive environment, then this is, you know, a really important stake in the ground in terms of things that have to change.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to come back with a question for each of you. There's one thing I want to say back to everyone in the room, and actually this is being recorded, is part of the invitation, and thank you both for coming to be part of this webinar, is that at Middlesex, with the DBA in healthcare, we're interested in gathering evidence base that will help us overcome real issues in real time. And so I guess my question to you would be, what would create a more inclusive environment that would, you know, if we were going to not see newspaper headlines like the one we're seeing now, or the reports that we're seeing now come out, what needs to change in the culture of how we train, teach, educate in surgery? Because you're both across surgery. What do you think, if you know, what would be one thing that you'd want to see different? Shall I go to Farah first and come back to you, Stel? Thanks.
Thanks, Vijaya. I guess it touches on what Stella said. You need to start early. It should be, you know, part of, it's a societal thing, isn't it? We're not in isolation. We're a microcosm of what's happening in society. But I think with my sort of medical school hat on, I'm EDI lead for graduate entry medicine in Swansea. I think the students are all over this. I think they are taught well. We're not by no means perfect, but they have a handle on intersectionality, about equity, about how to treat your patients and colleagues with respect. It's just that the current practice in the NHS is embedded sort of in the past. And I think part of that in terms of trying to improve things is we need to pick up low-level stuff. There's no point seeing that headline and saying, oh yeah, but you know, I sort of told people to avoid him or her, it's usually a him. But what do you do with these low-level behaviours? And I think that it's linked to people with bullying behaviour. It's a type of bullying. It's a power thing over somebody else. So I think it just needs to be, it's everybody's business. Now, sometimes when it's everybody's business, it's nobody's business, but one person can't be the policing things. It's about all of us. If you feel uncomfortable, if you think your fellow registrar or the nurse in the room is feeling uncomfortable, you pull them to a safe space and you take over. And when I was young, I wouldn't dream. I've had some terrible things said to me, and I wouldn't dream of being answered back because the TPD, the educational supervisor, says something really sexist, not been sexually harassed. Who do you go to apart from telling your friends? So we need to be able to say, hang on, that's not right. Why are you saying that? Pull the person to a safe space.
I think Farah's slightly frozen on my screen.
The patient is safe and speak to cell and productivity, again a term, and take care of your patient, be good for your team. If one of your team is carrying in a corner, frightened with a heart rate that's gone up because they're frightened of what might happen next to them. So personal safety. So I think it's empowering the whole team across the board and not just having tick box exercises. I've done my EDI training. It's an everyday behaviour that we need to instill. Thank you.
Thanks, Farah. Stel?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just going to acknowledge Jamie Mitchell has put a case, well, a dreadful story that affects people into the chat. And I think just to echo Farah, I mean, Vijaya, although we talk as surgeons, we work within the NHS and our teams are fabulous. The people that we work with are fabulous. And being an offender, a sexual offender, being someone who assaults, being someone who is a rapist, is not controlled or defined by the job they hold. And so we need to be understanding, and Farah, you're absolutely right. We need to call it out as we see it. I think surgery has been an interesting place to work. It has been male dominated. It has the same cultures actually that we see in many other professional institutions where there is hierarchy and tradition that is embedded into the way that we work. But this is not just about doctors. This has to be about everyone else. But if I speak to surgery, then often the conversations start with banter, with what's called banter, which is an interesting word in itself. And we have to remember that we work very closely as surgical teams. So the normal standards that we would have, which are personal space, so that the space that exists between you when you talk. Someone invades your personal space, you feel very uncomfortable. Well, in a theatre environment, everyone is jostled at the table. We're all together. You get used to being invaded into your personal space. There are conversations that happen across the table that wouldn't happen in any other environment. And you develop a social bond because you work so well together. But it redefines the boundary between personal and professional space. And so it's really, really important that every single individual, if we see it, we call it out. And that's the gentle end of surgical banter, which is, what were you doing last night? And, oh, that's really funny. And it's not acceptable. You work in a professional environment. We are privileged to work so well with the colleagues that we work with, but the professional standards that hold in any city firm, in any professional institute, need to be held within the NHS. And I say the Sexual Safety Charter, going back to the GMC regulations that we are bound by, we've got the Hippocratic Oath that sits with us. All of these are standards that are high bars that we need to ensure are embedded into our practice. But as senior leaders, as every single person has the responsibility and the accountability to call it out. Our role as senior leaders is to create the environment that can flourish.
Thank you. And in a minute, it will be interesting to see if questions are coming into the chat box that we can direct you to looking at those. But I think when I reflect back over what you have both contributed to and think of my time in working with leaders in the NHS, I can think also back to, in surgery, it took ages before we had a female president. And one of the first female, the only female president, the late Claire Marks, I remember one of the first interventions she made at the Royal College of Surgeons was in very simple, looking at the language that was permitted in theatre and trying to discourage swearing, because she identified it was the thin wedge of an edge that, if left unchecked, could ratchet up. And I guess the thing is, if you're part of a hierarchy, which is, we have in all different places in the NHS, then the power imbalance between the person who's feeling something's not right here requires people higher up and alongside them to look to the side and say, hey, you didn't imagine it. What are we going to do about it? So I guess my question to you both is, because this is now a discussion, it'd be helpful to just think of, what's one thing that you've seen worked when it comes to someone who maybe, I'm not talking about people who have done it accidentally and then self-corrected and then they know they don't do it, but people who seem to be getting away with it happening, and it becomes a story and it becomes part of the lived experience of people going through. What's the, beyond, legal action, so there's duty of care on behalf of the employer to employees, what's something that you think would work? If I start with you, Stella, and then go to Farah.
Struggling to come off mute. I think there are several interventions that work, Vijaya. I think one is the proactive, and it's not about trying to find things that are not there, but the proactive approach to colleagues. it's interesting, we talk about positions of power. If you talk to women who have reported unwanted sexual harassment at work, it has come from senior colleagues, and senior colleagues are normally surgical colleagues. If you talk to men, it is coming from nurses. Really interesting. So the traditional power base that we discuss is different in different areas. What we have seen that works is conversations that happen on a recurrent basis, which allow that building of trust so that people can say, actually, it's not that something really big has happened, but actually I'm feeling really uncomfortable because. Those are really helpful conversations. And then the ability to use almost the Chatham House rules to find out if there is anything else that's going on. Is this a single event, or actually is there more? The educational route through this is actually quite powerful, because through work-based assessments you can report almost anything through curiosity, to say, this is what happened yesterday and I don't really understand, could I have handled it in a different way? So we're training our trainees to ask questions with that dilemma that they hold, which keeps them safe because it's a safe environment. So I think the safety conversation, the psychological safety, we need to create that. But there is also the conversation of when we find this out, when we find out that there is a problem, it is not that it's just a conversation and it's held. There needs to be action, because that action role models the changes in behaviours that are needed, that are acceptable within a professional environment. So I think the role modelling of what we have seen happen, some cases have been large, have hit the press, but actually there are conversations that happen quite regularly where we can change things. But once they are changed, we need to make sure that people know anonymously that is what has happened in an organisation.
Thanks, Stella. I'll come to Farah, then I've seen a question that I'll ask you.
I guess Stella was sort of implying we work very closely, particularly in surgery, but I'm sure in lots of other teams. And there are close bonds. We rely on people in a way that we wouldn't in necessarily in other work environments. And speaking to the banter, we're not the fun police. We do occasionally like a laugh. But in terms of calling things out, I think people, if there is that sort of hierarchy, if I've called somebody out, a fellow consultant, about the way he was speaking to a male SHO, but the word pornography came up, so I sort of said, hang on a minute, inappropriate conversation. You flag it up to somebody more senior, at least the conversation stopped. I felt that the young colleague was safe, and completely inappropriate. And it's just, oh yes, he always says that. No, the response from the CD should have been, I'll have a chat with him, let him put his side of the story. Maybe I misheard. And actually it's a bit stronger than the cup of coffee conversation, because these low-level activities are what will eventually lead to something really serious and catastrophic. And we can't let this, and we're allowing it to happen. So absolutely, the loop should be closed if something is flagged up to you, however low level, because clearly if you keep doing low level stuff, at some point we'll cross the line. And the worst thing we should all be ashamed that we could have prevented something from happening by picking up these low level behaviours and have some consequence for the person who's behaving like that. So really it's to be a peer-to-peer or someone senior having those conversations and protecting our young colleagues.
And Farah, while I have you, before I get back to Stella, there was a comment on, should there be harsher penalties? Would you advocate the use of CCTV? What's your view on that?
I don't have any problems with CCTV. I don't think it should be in the particularly in the changing rooms or anything, but possibly that's where certain stuff happens. But it depends what you mean by sanctions, etc. It's definitely something needs to be documented. I'm not an employment lawyer, but I would want to know that something in my institution, if I was running one, that something had happened, something had been done about it, both parties were either assured or reassured or reminded of their responsibilities, and they let it lie. But then you can't sort of
I think it's slightly frozen, Farah. We just missed the last end of what you were saying, but we got most of it. Possibly you're on mute, but
you don't have a baseline denominator.
there we go.
If things are going really bad, but not at
Yeah.
I do swear occasionally, but not. I think I've lost. I'll let you carry on. I think my signal.
There's a little bit of a weak signal. No worries, we're all experiencing technical difficulties. So I wonder, there's a couple of things in the questions, comment areas. One is on what's the current process for staff who are experiencing this, either from other colleagues, so it's happening internally, or from patients. What's the process?
So they're really good questions. So Datex can be used. So and Beata, you've asked the same. So Datex can be used, but actually this is a conversation that goes to your line manager. If you're medical, it can go to the medical director. It can go to occupational health. If you don't feel that you feel safe, occupational health will hold your confidence and then raise this for you so that because it's unusual for this to be a lone episode. There are normally, it may be that the signal event, which is the large event that has caused someone great distress, which is why they feel they need to speak up. You know, that sentinel event is important, but actually there will be, as far as said, low level noise that has been heard for a long time. So and the I think it's Jamie that asked the question. Let me just go back up to apologize. Jamie, you've asked what would be approach if you woke up and saw your line manager being locked up for rape and sexual harassment. The question, Beata, then that follows is, you know, what's the appropriate route for support? This is the same conversation that should be happening if there was a death on a surgical table, on a theatre table. That team debrief, team understanding of how people are feeling, team debrief in terms of how you can support in the immediate aftermath. But then how do you put in processes that support that team to stop it from happening again? Is that CCTV, Farah? Again, conversation Christiane and I were having earlier about the number of women that feel safe going into a park at night time. You know, there's a tension between ensuring that we've got privacy, but also that we are protected. So there are longer, and it may be that actually CCTV does need to go up around where the bike shed is, because it's in the dark and people go and pick up their bikes in the evening, and that's where, you know. So I think there is the normal parameters that we would use for any incident are important here, but the Sexual Safety Charter is important because it also includes interventions that will help and will support. So please do read it, and every organisation is now signing up to it, so they should be embedding this in practice. Anyone who is in the call who is involved in an NHS institution, please ask whether it's been signed and how you can get involved.
Thank you. It's really interesting, isn't it? So I have just come off, there may be people on the call who've come off the United Nations Charter on the Status of Women. It was CSW 68 that happened earlier in this year. And one of the most attended sessions that I went to, which when I looked at this topic seemed to have great connection, and I wonder both your views on this, was looking at the fact that cities were designed by men. And actually, it's called Taking Back the Streets, and it's called Designing Smarter Cities. And so the project is being led by a female architect, and they're looking at the environmental factors that would make it possible, dissuade this kind of behavior, so that people could feel that they could go out and should feel safe. I'm wondering if we took that set of parameters to healthcare and to surgery particularly, what are some of the things that we could do to create an atmosphere that was more inclusive for women in surgery, quite specifically? I understand there's a minority of men for whom this is also an issue, but I'm really interested in looking at women in surgery. I'll start with Farah and then come to Stell.
Okay, thanks, Vijaya. It's interesting. I think I've read some of the stuff about what a perfect city would be if it factored around the women who take their children to school, who then come back, who then do this and that and the other, rather than being built around just rush hour when the men folk are going to work and then coming home. But I think it's similar to all these institutions. They were set up. I mean, the NHS is relatively new, but even when it was set up, and certainly for many hundreds of years, women weren't in the workplace. They weren't expected to be there, and some of these behaviours and you know, surgery is a very old profession, coming back to the barbers. So those expectations and have not really changed, and the work environment, you're right, certainly I know the workforce in nursing care is predominantly female, but certainly for doctors, that ethos, whilst we're trying to move forward, the people right at the top in the leadership positions who have the power to do something, not everyone thinks that this will be a wonderful webinar and embrace change. So I think what we really need to do is open up those leadership positions, the ones that come both with power and responsibility, and not just in this area. I mean, one of the big Kennedy reviews is, and I think Stella mentioned intersectionality, you know, the SAS doctors, the locally employed doctors, the, you know, people who've come IMGs, etc. All these subgroups I bet my money on the fact that the women amongst those groups are going to be subjected to even worse things. So I think we need to look at the whole round of things and actually make sure that we can, you know, the lift as you climb, you know, Mary Tyrrell Church, we've got to encourage and empower people to be able to speak up and open up those spaces, make it inclusive, make it, you know, I mean, I'm not talking about the Garrett Club because I don't particularly want to be a member of that kind of club, a bit like Groucho Marx, but we've got to make it safe for people and empower people of all sorts of diverse backgrounds to get into leadership positions and then actually affect change, because sometimes change and being more inclusive towards women, in this case, feels like a loss of power or status to the people who currently hold it, in my opinion. So, and interestingly, as a lot of my senior colleagues have children who are doctors who and happen to be female and coming up, these things are suddenly the newly converted allies. So we need our allies, and we need people to have actions rather than just words. Thank you.
Thanks, Farah. Stell?
Absolutely. I think the Royal College of Surgeons of England and Edinburgh, both, well, and the other colleges of surgery have all recognised that we have a problem. So the increasing number of females in surgery is wonderful to see. But I think, Farah, I can't remember the number. I think we decided it was going to be 2091, something like that, when we may get parity if we carry on at the same.
We did a paper and the graph did not look good. So
no,
we
exactly.
need more help.
So the response to the Kennedy report has very interesting interventions that will make a difference. So the parents in surgery, the understanding that it is not just about male and female, that hierarchy does make a difference, but the grassroots conversation therefore is important. So how do we ensure there's, you know, we've got the surviving and scrubs, but actually understand that different cultures need to coexist with that commonality of being a surgeon. And we should bring our roots to work. We should bring our culture to work with us rather than having to conform to my old-fashioned conversation was you need to look at the College of Surgeons website because it was very pale and male back in the day. It is much more different now. But you shouldn't have to conform to look like the college council in the old days. So I think there are various interventions that bring people's voices to the table, amplify them, and ask them to enjoy, wear with pride their culture, and the understanding that they will make a difference, and actually they are supporting the continuation of the NHS by coming into play. We know that where culture is well recognised, that the recruitment and retention is very good. So surgical hubs, which are doing phenomenal work with elective care, we've been accrediting those sites, and it is really clear to see now that where you've got great culture, involvement in day-to-day decisions, quality improvement embedded, that actually those are where we recruit and retain and recruit individuals, and they have a fulfilling career within the NHS. So that's what we need to aspire to.
There are some comments and some questions in the chat that I'm keen to get your opinions on. One is around, how do we address the shame, the stigma? You know, the victim in this is often the one carrying that. How would we address that within the culture as is? I'll go to Farah first and come back to you, Stel.
Well, clearly it's one thing supporting somebody through bullying, etc., where we probably all feel we could help, but this is a really specialist area. I mean, certainly for and what we've sort of alluded to earlier is there's so many ways of reporting and different mechanisms. So hopefully we'll have some sort of, it won't be one size fits all, but it's really important that all the policies are tightened out so people know. And there's various things, like we have a confidential support line for surgeons, and within that you can go and speak to somebody. That's on the Royal College of Surgeons website. But I think it's really important that we have experts who deal with this kind of thing, because I can speak informally to it, but I don't have the training to support and counsel rather than informally. So we need to take this seriously. I like the idea of going to occupational health. I do think in most hospitals that's a safe space, but we need people who are trained in dealing with people who've suffered at the hands of one of these events. It is specialist. I'm sure it's traumatic to relive this. I've had, as I said, plenty of sexist behaviour displayed against me, or misogyny, but not sexual harassment. And it would be terrifying to relive. It's bad enough reliving bullying episodes. So we need to have trained staff and signpost people to the appropriate support, whether that's at regional or national level. So, but it can't just be anybody. It has to be people specifically trained for supporting people in this specific context.
And Farah, whilst I have you, there's a question around, to what extent does an employer have duty of care or responsibility if the sexism or sexual harassment is happening outside of work?
I think if it's by one of the employees against a fellow employee, then I think they do have responsibility. Clearly, the perpetrator is a primary person who's responsible. And we have to remember, we're talking about things that are actually against the law. It's not something that I've been offended because, you know, you've said my earrings weren't pretty or something. Not that I wear earrings, but you know, these are criminal offences that we're talking about. So, but I personally, I don't know employment law, so I'm happy to be corrected. If somebody from my institution was sexually harassing, I came to know another person from my institution, or for anybody, not just for your own sort of the safety of the rest of your employees. Of course, I think they have a duty of care, but I would say that because I think people need, if that's your employee, they represent you. I mean, we've had all this thing about how you behave on social media, you're representing your profession, and I think employers have a duty of care to not brush things under the carpet in the good old-fashioned NHS way, and I love the NHS, but to actually take responsibility for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a slightly different question that was in the chat, and that's around the fact if people are getting comments to do with the menopause or any change to do with female life changes, Stel, how would that be tackled in the workplace? Is that sexual harassment if people are talking about the menopause?
So I've just typed an answer. So the answer is yes. Do you know what? There are fantastic. So menopause wasn't discussed. Menopause wasn't a thing. It's now become a thing, and people are now talking about it. And I'm going through it. And actually, it does mean that you suddenly start to find that you can't find the right words, that you get tired, you get hot, in very unfortunate circumstances, and you think, gosh, everyone knows. And actually, people don't know, but you know, and you know that you're not feeling right. You can't sleep at night, all the things that happen. But actually, this is now a conversation, and it's interesting. The Secretary of State for Health has made this an even bigger conversation. And so what I wrote in the chat was, yes, it is. It is a form of sexism. There are great tools out there for organisations to embed good practice into an organisation. But actually, you know, sometimes it needs someone to breathe life into these conversations and say, and there was also a conversation earlier, Vijaya, about if you're a young Asian female physio, and actually your line manager doesn't understand the discomfort you feel from what you're in your workplace because they don't understand how particular remarks affect you. This is the same conversation about menopause. Is yes, we have line managers and they are accountable to supporters, but sometimes they don't have the experience or the understanding to be able to do that. You therefore use them, but actually you move aside up whichever direction you need to and find someone who will support. So this is a great one. Menopause, I can't believe that you wouldn't be able to go into gynecology and find a gynecological consultant to say, look, this is not something that's been discussed in the organisation. Is this something we should go and find the female medical director and say, who will be experiencing probably symptoms of menopause, and say, is this a thing? Is this something we can raise the profile within the organisation and actually take some leadership roles in this and be encouraged and empowered to do something about it? But yes, these are all forms. It goes back to your conversation, Vijaya. Many things that we have are formed from traditional assessments and ways of working. We know that if you drive a car, the braking distance and the impact on someone's body has all been tested in the male field and not the female field, so the data is not right. We know the algorithms and some of the data fields that we use for blood tests, again, are male. Some of them may be female, but actually now there's a cultural difference in blood tests. So an Asian female's hemoglobin will be lower than a Caucasian. So there are many things, but by challenging and by increasing understanding and by creating yourself as a leader in that space, you can make a real difference.
Thank you. So a couple of things to do. We've got 5 minutes left, and I want to do a couple of things. I'm going to pass to my colleague Mary Hartog to just bring us to a close. The first thing I want to say is if there's anyone on the call who is experiencing difficulty, then please access the sources of help in your organization or reach out to us. You have our details, and we will do our best to put you in the right direction. It's never about you. So please don't be sitting. If there's anyone on the call thinking this is happening, I haven't been able to have the conversation, please do. I want to thank Farah and Stella for being here. Both of them are remarkable women who have broken the path in terms of some of what we're seeing in surgery and beyond. So for them being here today with us is a great thing that they've managed to do, and they extend this willingly because they believe in what they're saying. And I thank you for being here at what's probably your lunch break. There was a question in the chat. We can't get to everything in the short time, but it was about interesting to know who was on the call, what the demographic data is. I guess my leadership lens on this is the people who need to be on the call are never the ones that turn up. And so it's about spreading this message and sending it out there. But if Mary is on the call, I'd really like to first thank Roger for holding the room while I was away, and to pass it back to Mary for anything else that she wants to say from Middlesex, and to thank you all for being here today. So pass it back to Mary.
Hi, Mary. We're just inviting you to join us. I've just had a quick look across and just I can't have a completely accurate figure, but we had about 24 male sounding names and a total of 149 attendees register. That's not what we've got right here, but yes, just did my best to answer your question, Pauline. Mary, we've just invited you across. If you can, oh, she's joining. Brilliant.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you.
I think I'm unmuted now. Is that right?
I see and hear you. Thank you.
Lovely. Stella, Farah, I can't thank you enough. It really is tremendous having women, you know, of your position and caliber coming to talk to us about sexual harassment. And I do think, you know, the fact that you are in such powerful, as it were, professional positions in your own right makes a real difference, because that ability to give voice to this topic I think is challenging right across the board for all women, and it's so important that senior leaders such as yourself from eminent professions can speak up on our behalf and bring this to the table. Stella, you mentioned the menopause. One of our colleagues who works closely with Roger on other health issues to do with women and is actually running a session, I think, tomorrow on the menopause. So it is beginning, as you say, to be talked about. It's now a thing. And it wasn't even, I'd say, 10 years ago when I was going through it. It was still a taboo subject. So I think those, you know, lifting the ceiling on those conversations that are often clouded and contained by power relations. Again, thank you very much for doing that. I know we're out of time, and I hope we have a chance to invite you back to work with our DBA students. So we're running a DBA in Healthcare Leadership. Vijaya is one of our associate professors, and Roger is one of our leading research fellows in this field. So I was really delighted to hear how you saw all these topics of too hot to handle, the racism perspective, coming alongside in an intersectional way with what we're talking about today in terms of sexual harassment. So I just want to say to the audience, if anybody is interested in the DBA in Healthcare Leadership, what we're trying to do is put together a community of practice with the support of Joy Warmington and Vijaya Nath and Roger Klein and other close colleagues that will really challenge some of these fundamental wicked cultural issues within the NHS organisation. And we invite you from all sorts of leadership positions, both clinical and non-clinical. So if a DBA is what you would like to do, if you think that having those credentials can help you develop your influence and credibility in the environment that we're working in, we would love to hear from you. So thank you. You can look on the Middlesex website or find the link through Roger's amazing Twitter account. He's our living tweet link. Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you all for joining us today. Vijaya and Roger, Christiana, thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
And thank you, Farah. Thank you, Stella. Have great days, everyone. Look after yourselves. Bye, Roger.